In the desert north of Kingman, Arizona, the ground is splitting open. Long, jagged cracks, some of them wide enough to swallow a car and hundreds of feet long, are tearing across the bare land. They are called earth fissures, and they are not caused by earthquakes. They are caused by thirst. As Arizona pumps water out from under itself, faster than nature could ever hope to replace it. The emptied ground collapses in on the space where the water used to be, and the surface fractures. Across the state, something like 200 miles of these fissures have now been mapped, and they have undermined roads, ruptured canals, and snapped power lines. It is the most literal symptom imaginable of a crisis Arizona has spent decades trying not to look at directly. The state is running low on water, and the vast infrastructure built to store and move that water, from the very ground beneath people's feet to the great concrete dams on its rivers, is beginning to crack under the strain. This is the story of that crisis. And unlike most of the disasters I cover on this channel, this one is not a forecast, not a risk, not a warning about some distant future. It is already here. It is happening right now, this summer, and it has been building for a very long time. Let me lay out the problem, because it is stark and it is simple. Arizona is one of the driest states in America, and yet it is home to a booming population of millions and a sprawling, thirsty agricultural industry. All of that water has to come from somewhere, and it comes, essentially, from two great sources. About 36% of Arizona's water comes from the Colorado River, carried hundreds of miles across the desert through an enormous system of canals. And about 41% comes from groundwater, ancient water pumped up from aquifers deep beneath the ground. The remaining sliver comes from in-state rivers and recycled water. But those two pillars, the river and the aquifers, are what hold the whole state up. And right now, at the same moment, both of them are in serious trouble. Let me take them one at a time, because each is a crisis in its own right, and together they are something much larger. It is worth pausing on just how much engineering it takes to get Colorado River water to a place like Phoenix in the first place, because that infrastructure is central to the whole story. The river does not run through Phoenix or Tucson. It runs along the far western edge of the state. So Arizona built one of the most ambitious water projects in American history, the Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile system of open canals, tunnels, pipelines, and pumping plants that lifts Colorado River water out of the river near the California border and carries it uphill all the way across the desert to central and southern Arizona. Moving that much water that far against gravity takes staggering amounts of electricity. The canal is one of the single largest power consumers in the entire state. So Arizona's water and its energy are bound tightly together, and both run through the same fragile chain of infrastructure. When people talk about Arizona's water arriving, this is what they mean: an enormous, energy-hungry machine dragging a river across a desert, and every cut to the river's flow and every drop in the reservoirs that feed it is a cut to what that machine can deliver. Start with the Colorado River and with the dams. The Colorado is the lifeline of the entire American Southwest. It supplies 7 states, 30 Native American tribes, and part of Mexico. And it is shrinking. More than 2 decades of relentless megadrought, made worse by a steadily warming climate, have drained it to levels no one planning the system ever imagined. You can see that shrinkage most clearly in its 2 great reservoirs, the 2 largest man-made bodies of water in the entire United States. There is Lake Powell, held back by Glen Canyon Dam, and downstream from it, Lake Mead, held back by Hoover Dam, and both are, right now, perilously low. As of this year, Lake Powell sits at roughly 25% of its capacity. Lake Mead is at about a third. The 2 biggest reservoirs in America are running on almost no margin at all, a single bad year away from genuine catastrophe. And here is where the cracking of the dams becomes real and literal, but I want to be very precise about what that actually means, because it is not what most people would assume. The danger here is not that these dams are about to burst and send a wall of water crashing down on the cities below. It is very nearly the opposite problem. As the reservoirs behind them drain away, the dams are steadily losing their ability to do the 2 jobs they exist to do: to generate electricity and to move water downstream at all. Consider Glen Canyon Dam, which holds back Lake Powell. It was completed in 1963, and it was simply never designed to operate at the extraordinarily low water levels that Lake Powell is now approaching. And this is not a hypothetical concern, because there is, right now, documented physical damage to the dam's lower outlet works, the set of pipes deep in the dam used to release water when the reservoir gets low. That damage means that if the water drops below a certain level, around 30,500 feet of elevation, the dam may not be able to push enough water through to the other side. Sit with how alarming that is. Everything downstream of Glen Canyon Dam, including Lake Mead, including Arizona's own share of the river, including the water for millions of people and countless farms, depends on that water physically getting through the dam. And the infrastructure to do it is damaged, with, as of now, no plan to actually repair it. The only response so far has been a series of emergency maneuvers to keep the water level high enough that the damaged section never has to be used. Those emergency maneuvers are themselves extraordinary. In April of 2026, the Federal Bureau of Reclamation, which manages these dams, took unprecedented action. It began releasing water from an upstream reservoir, Flaming Gorge, specifically to prop up the level of Lake Powell and protect the threatened infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam. Infrastructure the agency itself openly says is at risk of damage from the low water. When the federal government starts draining one reservoir to save the plumbing of another, you are no longer looking at a comfortable margin. You are looking at a system in triage. And the same crisis plays out at Hoover Dam downstream in a different form. Hoover generates enormous amounts of hydroelectric power, but that generation depends on the water level in Lake Mead being high enough to drive the turbines. As Mead drops, Hoover's power output plunges. A drop of just 20 feet in the lake can cut its electricity generation by around 40%. The government is now spending $52 million to install new turbines at Hoover, specially designed to keep working at the historically low water levels that used to be unthinkable. That is what adaptation to this crisis actually looks like, re-engineering a 90-year-old national landmark because the water it was built around is disappearing. And beneath all of it looms a single, chilling phrase, dead pool. Dead pool is the water level at which the reservoir drops so low that water can no longer pass through the dam at all, the point where the lake is still there, but the river below the dam simply stops. For Lake Powell, dead pool sits at 3,370 feet. The reservoir is currently at around 3,527. That sounds like a comfortable cushion until you remember that the lake hit its all-time low of 3,522 just a few years ago, in 2023, and that another poor runoff year or two could erase most of what remains. As one Arizona official memorably put it, the region is trying to run on 19th century law, 20th century infrastructure, and 21st century hydrology. And that mismatch is exactly what is now beginning to break. Now layer on top of that the political crisis, because it makes the stakes for Arizona specifically almost hard to believe. The agreement that currently divides the Colorado River's water among the 7 states was struck in 2007, and it expires at the very end of 2026, months from now. The states are supposed to have negotiated a replacement. They are, instead, deadlocked, and if they fail to reach a deal, the federal government will impose its own plan for splitting the shrinking river. Under the leading no-deal federal proposal, Arizona faces cuts of up to 77% of its Colorado River share. 77%. No other state faces anything remotely close. Nevada would lose around 6%. And the other 5 states would see no cut at all. Arizona is singled out for that devastating reduction because of the legal pecking order of water rights, which places the water carried by the Central Arizona Project Canal near the very back of the line, first to be cut when there isn't enough. And this is not some far-off threat. Arizona is already, right now, going without 18% of its total Colorado River allocation. The cuts have already begun. The truly catastrophic one is about a year away. And the recent emergency releases upstream have raised the real possibility of the first ever lawsuits between the lower basin states, Arizona among them, and their upstream neighbors, as the whole century-old system of cooperation begins to fracture under the pressure. So, with the river shrinking and its dams straining, Arizona leans harder and harder on its other great pillar, groundwater. And this is where the crisis becomes, in some ways, even more permanent, and where the ground itself begins to break. Here is the crucial thing to understand about groundwater. It is ancient, much of it accumulated over thousands or even tens of thousands of years, and on any human timescale, it is essentially non-renewable. When you drain an aquifer, it does not simply refill with the next good rain. It can take centuries or millennia to recharge, if it ever does. And worse, when the water is removed, the empty ground can compact and collapse, permanently reducing the space available to ever hold water again. Pumping groundwater faster than it recharges is not like overdrawing a checking account that you can pay back next month. It is much closer to spending down a one-time inheritance that took 10,000 years to accumulate, and Arizona has been spending it fast. NASA satellites, which can actually measure the loss of water underground by detecting tiny changes in Earth's gravity, found that the aquifers of the Colorado River Basin lost about 27.8 million acre-feet of groundwater between 2002 and 2024, an almost unimaginable volume, enough to cover nearly 28 million acres of land in a foot of water. And the decline is accelerating. The NASA researchers behind that finding warned bluntly that the combination of the dwindling river and the dwindling aquifers puts Arizona's water security and its food production at great risk within the next decade. The clearest sign of that reckoning arrived in the Phoenix area. In 2023, the state released a sobering analysis of the groundwater beneath the sprawling Phoenix metropolitan region, and the conclusion made national headlines. The aquifer could not support all of the new development that had been planned to run on it. The projected shortfall was staggering, a deficit on the order of 4.6 million acre-feet over the coming century. In response, the governor effectively declared a moratorium, announcing that the state would no longer certify new housing developments in the Phoenix area that depended on groundwater. In plain terms, one of the fastest growing regions in the country had officially tapped out its groundwater for new growth. Now, I want to be fair and precise here. Because this was widely misunderstood, it did not mean that existing residents' taps were about to run dry. The established cities have other water supplies and stored reserves, and officials have been at pains to stress that people in the managed urban areas are not, in fact, running out of water. What it meant was narrower but still profound. That the era of endless desert growth fueled by simply pumping more groundwater was over. And even that limited protection is now under attack. In April of 2026, an Arizona judge ruled that the state water department had improperly changed the way it evaluated groundwater supplies for new homes, siding with the homebuilders who had sued to overturn the restriction. One expert called the decision a potential death knell for the state's landmark 100-year assured water supply rule, the very rule that requires developers to prove a century of water before they build. So even as the aquifers drain, the rules designed to protect what remains are being contested and chipped away in the courts, right now. And then there is rural Arizona, which is frankly the Wild West of water. Roughly 80% of the state, home to around 1.5 million people, lies outside the managed areas entirely, in vast stretches where groundwater pumping is completely unregulated. In many of these places, there are no limits on how much water can be pulled from the ground, and in some, not even any requirement to measure it. This has allowed large corporate agricultural operations, some of them foreign-owned, to sink deep wells and pump effectively unlimited quantities of groundwater to grow thirsty crops in the desert, sometimes for export overseas. The consequences for the people who live there are already severe. Rural household wells are running dry. Small local farms are being pumped into ruin by their industrial-scale neighbors, and the region's rivers are being drawn down. For years, Arizona lawmakers have tried and repeatedly failed to pass legislation to regulate rural groundwater at all. It is worth naming what most of this water actually goes to, because it reframes the whole crisis: agriculture. Farming consumes the large majority of Arizona's water, well over half, and by some measures around 70% of it. A great deal of that goes to growing extremely thirsty crops like alfalfa and other hay, much of which is used to feed cattle, and some of which is baled up and shipped overseas, which means that a share of Arizona's precious ancient groundwater is effectively being exported out of the state and even out of the country in the form of hay. This is not to villainize farmers who are operating entirely legally within a system that was set up to encourage exactly this, but it does put the cracks in a sharper light. When a rural family's well runs dry, or the ground opens up beneath a county road, the water that vanished did not mostly go to swimming pools and green lawns in the suburbs, as the popular image would have it. Overwhelmingly, it went to irrigated agriculture in a desert, under rules that in much of the state place no limit on it whatsoever. And this is where the earth cracks, where we return to those fissures north of Kingman. When you remove that much water from underground, the ground does not simply stay put. It collapses down into the void, a slow-motion process called subsidence. The land surface sinks, sometimes by many feet over the years, and as it sinks unevenly, it tears, opening up those long, deep earth fissures. Arizona has now mapped roughly 200 miles of them, and they are not a harmless curiosity. They swallow stretches of road, they rupture the very canals built to carry water across the state, they break power and sewer lines, and they crack the foundations of buildings. The physical infrastructure of Arizona is quite literally being undermined from below by the draining of the water beneath it. And here too, the damage is permanent. A collapsed aquifer and the cracked and sunken land above it can never be fully restored. So pull it all together, and you can see why this is a crisis of the present tense and not the future. The river is shrinking, and its dams are struggling to deliver water and power through infrastructure that is damaged and undersized for the new reality. The aquifers are draining, and the land above them is cracking open. The mandatory water cuts have already started, and a far larger one hangs over the state a year from now. The rules meant to protect what water is left are being fought over in court. And across most of the state, groundwater is being pumped away with no rules at all. Every single one of those things is happening right now, at the same time. And it is so agonizingly hard to solve precisely because it collides with everything modern Arizona was built on: an assumption of endless growth, an enormous and thirsty farming sector, a system of water rights written 100 years ago for a wetter world that no longer exists, and 7 states each deeply reluctant to be the one that gives up its share. Let me end, as I always try to, with honesty and balance, because a subject like this deserves clarity, not panic. Arizona is not about to crumble into a ghost state, and the taps in Phoenix and Tucson are not going to run dry next summer. It is genuinely important to say that plainly. In fact, Arizona has been in many ways one of the most far-sighted states in the entire country on water. Its landmark 1980 Groundwater Management Act was decades ahead of its time. Its Central Arizona project is an engineering marvel, and it has aggressively banked water for the future, storing millions of acre-feet underground for exactly the dry years now arriving. Those decisions have made its major cities far more resilient than their desert setting would suggest. And state officials are right to stress that urban residents are not running out of water. The dams, for all their troubles, are being actively and intelligently managed, and the emergency measures, however dramatic, are buying real time. And a crisis this severe can be its own kind of catalyst. The sheer weight of it is finally forcing the hard conversations Arizona has avoided for decades. About regulating rural groundwater, about serious conservation, about forging a new and more honest agreement over the river. The point of all of this is not that Arizona is doomed. It is that a comfortable and very old assumption has quietly died. The assumption that the water would simply always be there, that the desert could grow forever. That the rivers and the aquifers were a bottomless account that never had to be balanced. That assumption is finished. The bill has finally come due, and Arizona is being forced, right now, in real time, to learn to live within its actual means for the first time in its modern history. The managed cities may well navigate that transition. It is the rural wells running dry, and the canals rupturing, and the bare ground splitting open in the heat that show what it looks like where the reckoning has arrived without any plan to meet it. So, as of this summer of 2026, the 2 greatest reservoirs in America sit at 1/4 and 1/3 full, their dams straining to force water and power through infrastructure never built for lows like these. 7 states argue bitterly over a river that no longer holds what their grandfathers once promised one another. Phoenix builds outward until it presses against the hard limit of its own groundwater. And out in the desert north of Kingman, the ground goes on quietly splitting apart in the sun, one more crack opening in the dry earth, a slow, silent alarm that has been sounding, unheeded, for decades, in a state that is only now, at last, being forced to listen. Arizona's water crisis is not something that is coming. The cracks are already here. The only real question left is whether the reckoning arrives in time to matter, or whether, like the water itself, it comes too late.